Almost overnight, the COVID-19 pandemic has upended the entire nightlife and hospitality industries. Clubs are closed, events are canceled, weddings and other special occasions are being postponed. And as independent contractors, DJs, musicians, photographers, and other vendors are put in a financial strain. There's no income coming in. So the question is, what happens to contracts that were signed before the pandemic? Are they still in effect? Can they be altered? Can they be canceled? There's a lot of uncertainty. So the point of this vlog is to explain what a force majeure clause is and how it would affect existing contracts. This is a French expression which means by superior force, and it means the following. It's a list of specific circumstances which are so extraordinary that they prevent one party or both parties from performing their obligations under the contract. This is generally narrowly interpreted, so it's important to look at the exact text of the provision to figure out its scope and what events are included. And by that I mean the following. A lot of these provisions refer to an act of God, but an act of God is something that's somewhat vague, and it's not clear whether COVID-19 qualifies as an act of God. It hasn't been litigated yet. So this is not something that people should really hang their hats on. On the other hand, the provision could refer to a pandemic, an epidemic, health emergency, and I think that COVID-19 qualifies as a force majeure event under those. Now, in addition, a lot of governments have issued orders which limit the size of public gatherings. So if the force majeure provision refers to a government order or government regulation, then I would argue this would fall under the scope of the force majeure text. And by that I mean the following. Does the provision state that the force majeure extraordinary event is such that it makes it impossible for a party to perform its obligation, or does it make it inadvisable or impracticable for them to perform their obligation? And I think it would be best if I use an example in order to illustrate my point. Suppose you have a couple which is getting married on July 1st, 2020. They book a DJ to perform at the wedding reception. Now, COVID-19 happens, and the couple decides that they want to postpone their wedding, and they also want to get out of the contract with the DJ and just start afresh once they figure out a new date. Or, consider the alternative, the DJ does not feel comfortable performing at the wedding for safety reasons, and they also want to get out of the contract. So, we have to look at whether the provision makes it impossible or inadvisable for the parties to perform their obligations. Now consider this. A lot of governments, they have issued their orders limiting the size of public gatherings, but as far as I'm aware, as of making this video, none of these orders extend past June 2020. So that means that technically it's not impossible for the wedding to go on as scheduled on July 1st, 2020. However, because the country is reopening up in phases, it might not be advisable for the wedding to occur on July 1st, 2020. So again, important to look at the specific language of the provisions. In addition, we also need to look at whether the clause provides requirements of notice. And by that I mean whether one party has to give notice to the other party of its intent not to perform because of a force majeure event. So we need to look at how notice must be given. So for example, does the couple have to send an email? Do they have to make a phone call? Do they have to send a letter? And is there a specific time frame within which this has to happen? And that in essence is the force majeure provision. It excuses a party from performing its contractual obligation due to an extraordinary circumstance outside of its control. Now, I recommend that you look at your existing contracts and see what your force majeure provision states. Again, think about the things I just mentioned. What events are specifically included, how narrow or broad the provision is, and notice. Now, not every contract may have a force majeure provision. So again, that's why I recommend that you look at your specific contract. But there are other legal doctrines which a party may try to rely on to excuse non-performance of their obligations. The first one is the doctrine of impossibility and impracticability. Now, they are actually two separate legal doctrines. I'm merging them together to make things a little simpler. But in essence, what they are is that they excuse a party from performing its obligations due to an unforeseen circumstance. So the unforeseen circumstance makes it impossible or impracticable for the party to perform their legal obligations. Again, impossibility is a very high standard, where impracticability is a lower standard. So there's some similarities to what we talked about earlier about how narrow or how broad a force majeure provision is. And the other legal concept is that of frustration of purpose. And that means that an unforeseen condition defeats the purpose for which a party entered into the contract. So again, looking to our example of the couple and the DJ. The wedding is set for July 1st, 2020, and the couple booked the DJ to perform at the wedding reception for all of their friends. Now on July 1st, 2020, it's very likely that there will be some limitation as to the size of the gathering, meaning it's very likely that much fewer people will be allowed to go to the reception than originally the couple had planned. So therefore, this regulation will defeat the purpose of having a DJ because the size will be so severely limited. So the couple can argue that a government regulation due to the pandemic defeats the purpose for having the wedding. I hope this helped you better understand the force majeure provision in contracts and the other legal alternatives to it. It's worthwhile for you to look at your existing contracts and read what the provision says. And if there isn't one, think about having one in future contracts. Now, one more thing I should add. I'm not advocating that one party be heartless and totally not understanding of the other party's position. On the contrary, because we are living in extraordinary circumstances, I think parties should be flexible and try to work with one another in coming up with a compromise. But parties should also know what their contractual rights are, especially as events are being rescheduled. With that being said, thanks for tuning in to the Legal Mix, and I'll see you next time.